Here's how you can set up a very quick first-person character in Unreal. In your content browser, find your Blueprints folder, right-click and create a new Blueprint class. Choose the Character Parent class. That will get you a scene that looks like this, but without the camera. So you can add the camera component by going to the drop-down list here and selecting camera, and then just positioning it somewhere near the top of your character. I've used the movement script from the third-person character, so if you haven't got that, you can add that to your project from the content browser by clicking the Add button here, Feature or Content Pack, and choosing one. The first or third-person characters here will have very similar setups. You set up the input mapping to receive input from the advanced input system. Here's the camera controls. I've slightly modified them by inverting the Y value input, and then the rotation is added to the camera for looking up and down. And the movement input is left exactly the same as it was for the third person character. Same goes for the jump commands, and we set up our basic fire commands in the last video, so if you haven't seen that, check that out. Just a quick edit, I forgot to mention how you can set up your level to use your own specific character. You will need to create your own game mode. In this case, I simply copied the game mode from the third person template here and renamed it appropriately for a first person project. So this is my Blueprint first person game mode. Inside of the game mode blueprint, all you need to do is change here the default pawn class from third person character. In this case, I've changed it to the first-person character. If it doesn't look like this, you'll probably see it in the full editor view, but the details are still over here on the right-hand side. This is the default pawn class you want to change here. With the game mode set up, you will need to tell whichever level you have loaded to use this. If you're going to use this character for your entire game, then you can go Settings, Project Settings, Maps and Modes, and set your default game mode to be the one that you've just created, and now you'll be using this game mode and this character in every level. But if you want to only use this character for one level like I am here, you can go Settings, World Settings, and in the World Settings menu, which will pop up here, you have this option to override the game mode. So I've applied to this level my overridden game mode, so that when I press play, I spawn in my newly created character. With our controls set up now, let's start setting up the functionality for firing and spawning projectiles into the level. The first thing I want to do is create a location for bullets to be spawned in from. I'm going to do this using the scene component, which is a very basic component. If you look at it in the details panel, pretty much all it contains is a transform. You can't attach meshes to it. It has very, very few other functions that you can use. But it's really useful if you just need to hold a position in space. So in this case, I'm just going to drag it forward and position it somewhere out in front of my character here. Now if I hit play to test my controls out, you can't see the scene component at all, and that's not particularly useful. We can't really start aiming, or it can be useful to know exactly where it is for testing purposes. So I like to use the arrow component to do that. The arrow component by default will spawn in the middle of the actor, but because I had the scene component selected when I added the arrow component, it has been created as a child of the scene component. So if I move the scene component, the arrow will move with it. Select the arrow and zero out its transform. So its location is set to 0, 0, 0, and now it will match exactly wherever the scene component is. One last thing to make this useful. Take the arrow and in the rendering section of the details panel, uncheck the hidden in-game box. And now when you hit play, you should be able to see your arrow there floating around in front of your character. There'll be an issue with this, the way that it's been set up currently. If I look up or down, the arrow does not move with me, so I currently can't aim up or down. This is because the scene component is only a child of the capsule, and the capsule itself is not tilting up or down. So instead of that, if you take your scene component, click and drag it onto the camera actor, and now the scene component is a child of the camera. So as the camera moves, the arrow will move with it. Don't worry about the blurring on the actual little arrow on the screen. We're just using it for an indicator for testing purposes. Now that we have our scene location that we're going to use as a projectile spawn, let's just rename that quickly. Select your scene component, press F2 or right click and rename, and I'm just going to call this projectile spawn. What you would probably want to do if you were adding in your own custom weapons is have a specific socket on the skeleton or a scene component on the blueprint for your weapons, which would be the muzzle of it, or the center of the bow for launching arrows or something similar like that. Now we have our projectile spawn location. Let's create a projectile. In the content browser, I'm going to create a new folder for my weapons and ammunition. And in here, I'm going to create a new blueprint. It's going to be an actor, and I'm just going to call this one BP for blueprint, projectile base. Inside BP projectile base, we're going to need to add two components. Firstly, I'm going to add a static mesh so that we have something we can actually render and see, and I'm going to call this the projectile mesh. And for testing, I'm just going to add a cylinder. It's a bit big, but we can sort that out later. And the other component we need to add is going to be one that's built into the engine, the projectile movement component. This will handle, as its name implies, all of the projectile movement aspects of this projectile. Select the projectile movement, and if you take a look at the details panel, you have a number of options here for bounciness, friction, and gravity, but the ones I'm going to set initially here are the projectile initial and maximum speed. I'm just going to set each of these to 4,000. You can use whatever value you want, and you should probably set them up differently for each projectile so everything has a slightly different feel in your game. The projectile is now set up for testing purposes anyway, so let's head into the character and change our primary fire button script. Instead of just saying hello on a print string, bang on a print string, we're going to use the spawn actor from class node. And if I'm going to hook that up to the started call on our enhanced input action event. So when we start to press this action, we're going to spawn in the projectile. Select the class, that was BP projectile base, and you need to feed in a spawn transform. What location is this object going to be spawned at? Well, thankfully we have our projectile spawn. This is the scene component we created earlier, and we can get the world transform for that scene component and plug that in right there. And this should be functional enough to test now. Hit play, and every time I click, we're lobbing these cylinders out across our level.